Go back to your football games, little boy. My name is Alex Morgan. I'm 29 years old, and I've been working at NextGen Dynamics in Austin for 4 years. I hold 7 pending patents for the core framework that runs their entire product line. The woman who just dismissed me like I was some college dropout is Victoria Reed, 26, fresh out of Northwestern with her MBA and 0 real experience. She's also the new Chief Technology Officer's daughter. I was sitting at my workstation at 8:30 p.m. on a Wednesday, debugging the authentication module for our upcoming product launch. The office was empty except for the cleaning crew and me. I preferred it that way. No interruptions, no meetings about meetings, just code and coffee. Victoria walked by in her designer heels, carrying a stack of papers that probably contained nothing more technical than a marketing proposal. "Still here, Alex," she said, stopping at my desk. "Don't you have a life outside this place?" I looked up from my screen, just finishing up the security patch for the launch. She glanced at my monitor like she was trying to read hieroglyphics. "Right, well, maybe you should take a break. Go back to your fantasy football games, boy. Leave the real work to people who understand it." I didn't respond. I never played fantasy football. I spent my evenings writing code that kept their systems from crashing. But explaining that to someone who thought technical expertise came with a family name seemed pointless. After she walked away, I sat there for a moment staring at the lines of code I'd written. Every algorithm, every security protocol, every efficiency improvement that made their platform competitive had come from my mind and my hands. The patents I'd filed were still pending, which meant they were mine until the legal paperwork transferred ownership to the company. That process typically took 8 months. We were only 4 months in. I saved my work and packed up my laptop. As I walked to the elevator, I noticed the conference room lights were on. Through the glass, I could see Victoria presenting something to her mother, the new CTO, Eleanor Reed. They were laughing about something, probably another way to streamline the development team. Eleanor had been in the job for 3 weeks, and was already talking about fresh perspectives and new leadership approaches. The elevator doors closed, and I realized something had shifted in my chest. Not anger exactly, more like clarity. I'd been carrying this company's technical backbone for years, while watching less capable people get promoted around me. Now I was being treated like hired help by someone who couldn't debug a simple loop. I drove home through the Austin rain thinking about what tomorrow might bring. I joined NextGen right out of college, when it was still a 50-person startup working out of a converted warehouse in East Austin. Back then, the original founder, Marcus Chen, would sit with us during late-night coding sessions, ordering pizza and talking through complex architectural problems. He understood the technology because he'd built the first version himself. Marcus stepped down as CEO 8 months ago to focus on his health, pancreatic cancer stage 3. The board brought in Eleanor Reed from a big consulting firm to professionalize the operations and prepare for scale. Eleanor had an impressive resume managing large teams, but her technical background was limited to whatever she'd learned in business school 12 years ago. My patents covered the core authentication system, the data compression algorithms, and the real-time synchronization framework that made our platform unique. Without those components, NextGen was just another cloud storage company with a fancy interface. I developed them during my own time using my personal equipment because I wanted to solve problems that the company hadn't even recognized yet. The patents were filed under my name because I'd paid for the legal work myself. Standard practice was to transfer them to the company once the paperwork was complete, but that hadn't happened yet. My lawyer had advised me to wait until after the next performance review cycle to ensure I got proper recognition and compensation for the intellectual property. Victoria had joined the company 3 months ago as a strategic intern, reporting directly to her mother. She had no official technical role, but she'd been sitting in on engineering meetings and offering suggestions about resource allocation and timeline management. Last week, she'd suggested that the development team was overstaffed and that we could probably deliver the same results with fewer people. I'd been watching the dynamic between mother and daughter carefully. Eleanor would ask Victoria's opinion on technical decisions that she should have been discussing with the engineering leads. Victoria would nod thoughtfully and offer management-speak responses about efficiency and agile methodologies. Neither of them ever asked me about the technical feasibility of their ideas. The warning signs had been there for weeks. My name had been removed from the internal technical documentation without explanation. Meeting invites that used to include me automatically were now going to senior staff only. When I asked about it, Eleanor's assistant told me it was just a scheduling oversight. Yesterday, Heidi overheard a conversation between Eleanor and the head of human resources about restructuring the technical team to better align with company goals. They hadn't noticed me in the break room, and I hadn't made my presence known. Now, after Victoria's comment about fantasy football, the picture was becoming clear. They were planning to push me out, probably after the launch, when my work was complete, but before my patents transferred to the company. I pulled into my apartment parking garage and sat in my car for a few minutes, listening to the rain on the roof. The next morning, I arrived at the office early and found an email waiting for me. The subject line read, "Team restructuring, please review." It was from Eleanor, sent at 12:15 a.m. the night before. The email outlined a new organizational structure that would take effect after the product launch in 2 weeks. My role was being transitioned to a more junior position, focused on maintenance and support rather than core development. My salary would remain the same, but I'd be reporting to a new hire who had been brought in to lead the technical vision going forward. The new hire was someone I'd never heard of. According to his LinkedIn profile, which I looked up immediately, he had a computer science degree from a decent school and 6 years of experience at companies I recognized. Nothing impressive, but nothing obviously wrong either. What bothered me was that they made this decision without consulting me or even informing me until after the hiring was complete. I sat back in my chair and thought about what this meant. They were keeping me around long enough to ensure the launch went smoothly, then sidelining me before I could become a threat to their new management structure. My patents would transfer to the company in 4 months, giving them permanent ownership of the technology I'd created. After that, I'd be expendable. The office started filling up around 9 a.m. I watched people settle into their routines, checking emails and grabbing coffee. None of them knew what was coming. Most of them probably wouldn't care. They had their own careers to worry about. At 10:45 a.m., Victoria walked past my desk, carrying a tablet and looking important. She was wearing a different designer outfit, and had her hair pulled back in a way that made her look older than her 26 years. She glanced at my screen where I had the reorganization email open and smiled. "Morning, Alex. Ready for another exciting day of development work?" I looked at her for a moment, then at the email, then back at her. Something clicked into place in my mind. This wasn't just about management, restructuring, or efficiency improvements. This was about removing me specifically, probably because I knew too much about how the technology actually worked. I closed the email and opened my file management system. My patents were stored in a secure folder on my personal cloud account, not on the company's servers. The code I'd written was integrated into their platform, but the underlying frameworks were still documented in my private repositories. I started making a list of everything that belonged to me versus everything that belonged to the company. The list was longer than I'd expected. At 12:30 p.m., I packed up my personal laptop and walked out to my car. I didn't tell anyone where I was going. I just needed to think clearly about what came next. I drove to a coffee shop near Lady Bird Lake and spent the afternoon making phone calls to my lawyer. I returned to the office the next day with a plan. I'd spoken with my lawyer, Daniel Wright, for 2.5 hours the previous evening. He'd reviewed my employment contract and confirmed what I already suspected. My patents were still my property until the transfer paperwork was complete. More importantly, any code ID written using those patented processes belonged to me until the intellectual property formally changed hands. I decided to confront Eleanor directly. Professional, straightforward, no accusations. I wanted to give her a chance to explain the reorganization and see if there was room for negotiation. I knocked on her office door at 3 p.m. She was on a conference call, but she motioned for me to sit down. Through the glass wall, I could see Victoria in the adjacent conference room, presenting something to a group of people I didn't recognize. Probably more consultants brought in to evaluate our operations. Eleanor finished her call and turned to me with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Alex, thanks for coming by. I assume you've had a chance to review the restructuring proposal." "I have." I wanted to discuss my role going forward and make sure we're aligned on expectations. She leaned back in her chair. Of course, I know change can be difficult. But I think you'll find that the new structure gives you more opportunities to focus on what you do best. Which is what, exactly? Maintenance, optimization, supporting the development team. The kinds of technical tasks that require deep knowledge of our existing systems. I kept my voice level. Eleanor, I designed those existing systems. The authentication framework, the compression algorithms, the synchronization protocols, those are my patents. Her expression shifted slightly. Well, yes, you've certainly made important contributions. But as you know, all intellectual property developed during your employment belongs to the company. That's standard in our industry. The patents haven't transferred yet. According to my employment contract, that doesn't happen until the legal review is complete. She picked up a folder from her desk and flipped through it. Actually, I've been meaning to discuss that with you. Our legal team has identified some concerns about the patent filings. There are questions about whether the work was done using company time and resources. I felt my stomach drop. I filed those patents using my own equipment, on my own time. I have documentation to prove it. I'm sure you do. But perception can be tricky in these situations. The board is concerned about potential liability issues. If we move forward with the transfer as originally planned, this was a trap. They were going to claim that my patents belonged to the company regardless of the legal documentation. Then tie me up in litigation that I couldn't afford to fight. Even if I eventually won, the legal costs would bankrupt me and the product launch would be long over. What are you proposing? We'd like you to stay in your current role through the launch. Help train the new technical lead, and then we can discuss a transition timeline that works for everyone. I stood up. I need some time to think about this. Of course, but Alex, I hope you understand that this is really the best outcome for everyone involved. Fighting this would be expensive and disruptive, and ultimately the company's position is very strong. I walked back to my desk and sat down, my hands shaking slightly. They had me cornered. If I tried to fight for my patents, they'd claim I'd stolen company intellectual property. If I agreed to their terms, I'd lose everything I'd created and end up in a dead-end job. Through the glass conference room wall, I could see Victoria finishing her presentation. The people she was talking to were nodding and taking notes. One of them was pointing at a chart that looked like an organizational diagram. My computer pinged with a new email notification. The sender was Human Resources. The subject line read, Updated Employment Agreement. Please review and sign. I didn't open it. Instead, I started thinking about what Daniel had told me during our phone call. The patents were mine until they weren't. The code was mine until it wasn't. But what if I removed my code from their systems before they could claim it? That would be sabotage, legally speaking. But what if I simply declined to renew the licensing agreement I'd never formally signed? I opened my personal cloud storage and began reviewing the documentation for my patents. That evening, I stayed late again, but this time, I wasn't debugging code. I was conducting an audit of everything I'd contributed to NextGen's platform over the past 4 years. The results were more extensive than I'd realized. My authentication framework was integrated into every user login, every API call, and every data transfer. Without it, their system would revert to basic username-password security that any halfway competent hacker could bypass. The compression algorithms I developed reduced their storage costs by approximately 65%, and made their platform fast enough to compete with larger companies. The synchronization protocols enabled real-time collaboration features that were central to their marketing message. I'd essentially built the technological foundation that made NextGen competitive in their market. Everything else was just user interface and business logic built on top of my work. But the deeper truth was more complicated. As I reviewed old emails and meeting notes, I found evidence that Eleanor and Victoria had been planning this move for weeks before the reorganization announcement. 3 weeks ago, Eleanor had asked the development team to document all of our technical processes and create detailed system architecture diagrams. She'd framed it as a routine knowledge management initiative. 2 weeks ago, Victoria had requested access to our code repositories for for a strategic analysis of development efficiency. I'd granted the access because she was the CTO's daughter, and I'd assumed it was legitimate. Last week, I discovered that someone had been copying files from our shared drives to an external location. When I'd reported it to IT security, they told me it was authorized by senior management for backup purposes. Now, I understood what had been happening. They'd been systematically documenting and copying everything I decreated so they could continue using it after pushing me out. The plan was probably to claim that my patents were derivative works based on company resources, making them company property regardless of the legal filing status. I found an email thread between Eleanor and someone at their law firm, discussing intellectual property acquisition strategies and minimizing developer leverage. The thread was dated 3 days after Eleanor had started working at the company. This wasn't about reorganization or efficiency. This was a calculated plan to steal my work. I spent the next hour researching Eleanor's background more carefully. Her previous job had been at a consulting firm that specialized in technology acquisition and integration. Before that, she'd worked for a venture capital company that focused on buying distressed startups and extracting value from their intellectual property. She wasn't brought in to grow NextGen. She was brought in to strip mine it. I called Daniel and explained what I discovered. He listened carefully, asked several questions about the timeline, and then delivered news that changed everything. Alex, based on what you're telling me, you have grounds for a cease and desist order. Your patents are still your property, and if they're using your technology without a formal licensing agreement, that's patent infringement. But I'm employed by them. Doesn't that create an implied license? Not necessarily. Employment contracts typically cover future inventions, but your patents predate the specific language in your current contract. There's a gap in their legal coverage. I felt something shift in my chest. Not anger this time, but clarity mixed with a cold determination. What would happen if I revoked their access to my technology? Legally, you have that right. Practically, it would probably crash their systems until they could develop alternative solutions. I looked around the empty office, thinking about Victoria's dismissive comment about fantasy football and Eleanor's patronizing smile during our meeting. How quickly could you draft the cease and desist order? I can have it ready by tomorrow morning. I made my decision. Do it. The next morning, I arrived at the office early and began implementing what Daniel and I had discussed. The cease and desist order would be delivered to Eleanor at 10:30 a.m., giving me a narrow window to prepare for the consequences. My first step was to change all the passwords and access credentials for my personal cloud storage systems. NextGen's platform was designed to authenticate against my proprietary security framework. But the framework itself was hosted on servers I controlled, not on company infrastructure. I'd built it that way initially as a security measure, but now it gave me leverage I hadn't fully appreciated. At 10 a.m., I sent an email to the entire development team explaining that I would be conducting routine maintenance on the authentication system starting at 11:30 a.m. These kinds of notifications were common, and nobody questioned them. At 10:30 a.m., I watched through the glass wall as a courier delivered an envelope to Eleanor's office. She opened it, read the contents, and immediately picked up her phone. Within minutes, Victoria was in her office, and they were both staring at the legal document. At 11 a.m., Eleanor's assistant called my extension and asked me to come to the conference room immediately. I declined, explaining that I was preparing for the scheduled maintenance window and couldn't be interrupted. At 11:30 a.m., I remotely disabled the authentication framework that connected NextGen's platform to my patented security system. The effect was immediate and comprehensive. Every user login attempt failed. Every API call returned an authentication error. Every real-time collaboration session dropped connection. Within 20 minutes, the customer support phone lines were overwhelmed with complaints. The platform status page showed red alerts across all services. The development team was scrambling to understand what had gone wrong. My phone started ringing. I didn't answer it. At 12 p.m., Eleanor stormed out of her office and walked directly to my desk. Her face was red and her hands were shaking. "Alex, what the hell have you done?" I looked up from my laptop, where I was calmly reviewing system logs. "I'm exercising my legal rights, as specified in the cease and desist order. My technology is no longer available for unauthorized use." This is sabotage. You're destroying the company. I'm protecting my intellectual property. There's a difference. Victoria appeared next to her mother, looking panicked. Can't you just turn it back on? We can work this out. I met her eyes directly. You told me to go back to my fantasy football games. I'm taking your advice. I'm no longer participating in the technical operations of this company. Eleanor was on her phone, probably talking to their lawyers. Other employees were gathering around my desk, trying to understand what was happening. The platform had been down for 50 minutes, and their biggest clients were starting to make angry phone calls. At 12:45 p.m., I packed up my personal laptop and headed for the elevator. The office was in chaos. Developers were running between workstations trying to implement emergency fixes that wouldn't work because they didn't understand the underlying architecture. Eleanor was in heated conversation with someone on speakerphone, who was probably from the board of directors. As the elevator doors closed, I could hear Victoria shouting at one of the senior developers. What do you mean you can't access the authentication system? Just bypass it. The developer response was exactly what I'd expected. We can't bypass it. The entire platform is built on Alex's framework. Without it, we have nothing. I drove home and spent the afternoon fielding phone calls from reporters who had somehow gotten word that NextGen was experiencing major technical difficulties during their pre-launch testing period. The next few days were going to be very interesting. The product launch was scheduled for Tuesday morning at 10 a.m. Central Time. Eleanor had spent the previous 4 days assembling an emergency team of contractors and consultants to rebuild the authentication system without my patented technology. According to my contacts still inside the company, they'd been working around the clock, spending over $250,000 on emergency consulting fees. I woke up early on Tuesday and made coffee while monitoring the technology news websites. Several industry publications had picked up the story of NextGen's technical difficulties, but the full scope of the problem wasn't public yet. At 10 a.m., I watched the live stream of their product launch event. Eleanor was presenting to a room full of investors, potential clients, and technology journalists. She looked confident as she demonstrated the new features and talked about the company's growth trajectory. At 10:45 a.m., during the live demonstration portion of the presentation, she invited the audience to test the platform themselves, using guest accounts that had been set up specifically for the launch event. The system crashed immediately. Not just a slow response or a minor glitch, complete failure. The emergency authentication system they built could unhandle the concurrent load of 60 users trying to log in simultaneously. Error messages cascaded across the screen. The database connections timed out. The entire platform became unresponsive. Eleanor tried to keep presenting while her technical team scrambled to fix the problems in real time. But after 15 minutes of watching engineers frantically typing on laptops while the audience whispered among themselves, she had to stop the demonstration. We're experiencing some minor technical difficulties, she announced, her voice betraying her growing panic. We'll resume the demonstration shortly. They never resumed it. After 45 minutes of failed attempts to restore functionality, Eleanor ended the event early and asked everyone to leave. The technology blogs published their reviews within hours. The headlines were brutal. NextGen launch crashes spectacularly. Tech company falls apart during live demo. When ambition meets reality, a startup cautionary tale. The board of directors called an emergency meeting for Wednesday morning. By Wednesday afternoon, Eleanor Reed was no longer the chief technology officer of NextGen Dynamics. The press release cited strategic differences regarding technical leadership and company direction. Victoria Reed was quietly removed from the intern program without any public announcement. According to my former colleagues, she'd attempted to blame the platform failure on sabotage by a disgruntled employee. But the board's investigation revealed the chain of events leading to my departure. Her accusations only highlighted the management failures that had caused the crisis. The company's stock price, which had risen in anticipation of the product launch, dropped 38% over the following week. 3 major clients canceled their contracts. 2 board members resigned. Meanwhile, I was fielding phone calls from venture capital firms and technology companies who wanted to license my patents. By the end of the month, ID signed licensing agreements with 3 of NextGen's competitors and founded my own startup with $15 million in Series A funding. The new company, which I named Citadel Security Solutions, specialized in enterprise authentication solutions. Our first major client was a financial services firm that had been burned by unreliable security platforms in the past. Our second client was a healthcare company that needed compliance-grade authentication for patient data systems. 7 months later, NextGen was acquired by a larger company for a fraction of their previous valuation. The acquiring company's first move was to completely rebuild the platform using industry-standard security frameworks, effectively discarding everything that Eleanor and Victoria had tried to preserve. Eleanor Reed returned to consulting work, though her reputation in the technology sector had been significantly damaged. Victoria Reed left the tech industry entirely and took a marketing job at a retail company in Dallas. Neither of them ever acknowledged their role in the company's collapse, but the technology community has a long memory for failed leadership. When reporters asked me why I'd left NextGen so abruptly, I kept my answer simple. Sometimes walking away is the best way to protect what you've built. The real lesson was quieter, but more important. Respect and competence can't be faked. And dismissing someone because of their age or background is a mistake that compounds quickly in an industry built on knowledge and innovation.